So I'm Amanda Dubberly, and I'm the Assistant Curator and Academic Liaison at the William Benton Museum of Art. And I'll be moderating tonight's panel discussion, COVID and Creativity. So the panel is held in conjunction with the 2020 Studio Art and Digital Media and Design Faculty Exhibition, which is on view in the Benton Museum through tomorrow, and also on our website. So I'm joined tonight by 5 faculty who are featured in the exhibition, and they will each give a short illustrated talk and will hold all questions for the Q&A and discussion at the end of the program. So thank you to all of our panelists for being here tonight. So I'm going to introduce them very briefly in order of their appearance in the program. So we'll hear from John O'Donnell first. He is Associate Professor of Printmaking in the Department of Art and Art History. He's a printmaker and new media artist. And John's recent solo exhibitions include Flowerbox Projects in Miami, Florida, and the New Bedford Museum of Art in Massachusetts. So after John, we'll hear from Heejoo Kim, an assistant professor of motion design and animation in the Department of Digital Media and Design. She is an animated filmmaker and new media artist, creating projects that focus on social issues. Heejoo's films have screened this year at Roma Cinema DOC in Rome, Italy, and Census Film Festival in St. Petersburg, Russia. Alison Paul will be our third speaker. She is Associate Professor of Illustration and Animation in the Department of Art and Art History. She creates illustrations and stop motion animations using cut paper collage. In addition to writing and illustrating books for children, Alison is artistic coordinator of Art in the Park for Greater Kennedy Plaza and the City of Providence. So Samantha Olschan will be our penultimate speaker. She's Assistant Professor of Motion Design and Animation in the Department of Digital Media and Design. She's a transmedia artist who works across animation, art design, and visualization for TV, films, documentaries, and media agencies. Last year, Samantha's documentary, Class of 2032, won awards for Best VFX and Color from the Hollywood North Film Awards. And so our last speaker will be Janet Pritchard, Professor of Photography in the Department of Art and Art History. She's a photographer who works at the intersection of nature and culture. In 2019, Janet was awarded 2 artist fellowships from the Connecticut Office of the Arts, 1 independent and 1 collaborative, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. So John, if you'll take it away, please.
All right. This is strange not seeing the audience, but I'm going to do just fine. All right. My name is John O'Donnell, and I teach printmaking. Let me set my timer. At the beginning of 2020, I had been working on a project that used ideas found in 18th century printmaking as far as building structure and seeing structure were involved. And I traveled to Rome in January of 2020 to do research for a project I was going to pursue in the print studio. And these are some images of that research. The largest photograph I took in the Roman Forum, the top image that looks like an old etching is an old etching by Piranesi from around 1750, and then another image from Wikipedia. And I'm interested in looking at all these different images and the way that I, as a kind of a tourist or a researcher, capture images, the way the internet collects images, and the way that art history has collected images. So here's an image of a structure in the Roman Forum, and it's pretty much overlooked. It's not on any of the main maps, and you kind of have to dig through these different sites to find it. It's a door to the House of the Vestal Virgins. And I wanted to focus on this structure through printmaking using a historical method and a contemporary method to bring color to the structure. As I was working in the print shop, we were asked to leave the print shop because of COVID. And at the same time, an exhibition of that work was supposed to open, or this project in process was supposed to open in New Haven, and that was canceled. And I had just had an opportunity to install the work, and the opening was canceled and the artist talk was canceled. So at least the work was able to be installed but never seen, but I got some install photos. And we had to reschedule the artist talk to Instagram and my performance to Instagram, which actually ended up being beneficial because there's no way that 89 people would have seen my artist talk in the gallery. So that's one way that we kind of pivoted and responded to the reality that the opening was not going to happen. And it actually ended up okay. And I also transferred my performance online to Instagram, which is something I hadn't done. And it's something I'll have to do for an upcoming performance in Miami. So I'm going to just kind of click past that. And one thing that I did when I was removed from the studio is that I used it as an opportunity to kind of collate and organize all of my thoughts and my research into a book, which I honestly probably wouldn't have done unless I had to leave the print shop. So it was a moment where I was able to take a look at what I was doing and reframe it in a way that I probably wouldn't have reflected on unless the quarantine happened. And I think that it ended up being a nice way for me to process my ideas that I hadn't really used in the past. So this is one way that I responded to being removed from the print studio. I also had another project that I wasn't quite sure I was going to get to, which was doing a series of watercolors based on the baths of Caracalla. And this is it's a tourist attraction, but it's a little bit off the beaten path. It's about a mile, maybe a mile and a half south of the Colosseum. And it's relatively unpopulated by tourists as it would be compared to the Colosseum. And what I really liked about this structure and location was that there was a lot of red bricks, a lot of blue sky, and a lot of fences and green grass. And I thought it was just kind of a curious way to experience a ruin in this really manicured and kind of landscaped and really considered by a landscape architect in terms of the foliage that was existing there. And so I did a series of watercolors in a way reflecting on the domestication of these ruins. And that's implied by the green grass and the kind of white picket fence as this typical image of, kind of outdoor domesticity. And so you see a lot of images of fences that are preventing people from getting to the grass, and then they're framed by these red bricks. So this was an opportunity to kind of reflect on some research that I wanted to do, but wouldn't have been able to unless I was working from home. While I was on quarantine, there was a lot of thought and talk about time, and everyone's talking about when this time will occur, when will this be done, how long are we going to be here, when's this going to happen? And so I made a series of stickers that I sold on Instagram, and they were about time. And kind of the slogans speak for themselves. The imagery is familiar. For example, the Calvin character we see on the back of a lot of different cars and pickup trucks. It was much more prevalent in the 90s, but they still exist. I also was spending a lot of time looking at my phone and reading online, and I realized that I was really inundated with clickbait. And I did a series of collages using clickbait headlines and images. I took the headline from the previous article and paired it with the image of the current article. So kind of rearranging headlines and images. And what I did was I put that into a book as a way to kind of translate the online reading that I was doing into something a little bit more tactile and tangible, which was something that I think we're all missing, tactility and tangibility during this time. And so there are these kind of these non sequiturs that just emerged accidentally through reading online content. And it's definitely a callback to the surrealist drawing games and kind of pairing of image and text, which is such a topic in contemporary art and traditional art too. I also have like kind of a little clothing company where I sell t-shirts and stickers and things like that on Instagram. And I use that as a way to pivot to kind of do something a little bit more socially engaged. And I was able to sell, it was a small amount, like around $350 worth of t-shirts that were donated to BLM. And that was just kind of this moment to be part of the dialogue, using the resources that I had and the audience that I had in a positive way, which I think I was spending a lot of time wondering, like, how can I contribute in a way that's kind of honest and genuine? And this was like almost the best I could do And it ended up being a fun project and a process, and really participated in a dialogue with a lot of people I might not otherwise. And I also had a lot of time to paint in my garage when I didn't have access to my studio on campus. And I'll just kind of click through these. These are images of paintings in process. That a lot of these are on view at the Benton, but these were all done with spray paint, stencil, and acrylic paint, house paint, and wide brushes. And yeah, so then a lot of these were about creating these like kind of weird Pepto-Bismol-y, kind of like sterile environments, kind of these exaggerated images of sterility combined with like some domestic spaces that were, you know, definitely informed by being in quarantine. And there's a collection of them in my studio, and that's all I have. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, John. So Heejoo, we'll hear from you next.
All right. I'll share my screen. Okay. Thank you for Amanda introduce me and then invite me about this presentation. My name is Heejoo Kim again. I'm teaching in digital media and design department. Concentration is motion design and animation. And I'm going to talk about how my adaptation and way of adaptation to the challenges posed by COVID-19. So I'm working on, I'm going to talk about upcoming work that started before COVID, and we have a lot of problem right now. So my ongoing process with this film. So I'm working on motion graphic for documentary film, and then my own animated film. So I'm working on two projects related this miniature loom. So this is the animation that I'm working on. It's going to be experimental documentary animated film, explore the mystery of the loom. So if you take a look at here, it's a little bit hard to see it, but because of this shadow, but there's like 4 names of the girls. And then this animation is story of the war, the mass rapes and the suicide leading up siege of Berlin by the Red Army in 1945. So I forgot to put the other collaborators, but we have 2 co-directors and me who used to be in New York City. And then one photographer is California, and then the other music composer in New Haven, and 3 students working for this project. So before COVID, we actually worked on like synopsis, and then we were start working on script. So a script part, because we can share the Google Drive and we can do other meetings, but we used to meet and then talk about the script. But while we're working on the script for the trailer, the COVID happens, and then we kind of stop everything and we pause everything. And one of our collaborators actually moved from New York City to Hartford. And then, but we couldn't meet each other at the time. So we used to do Zoom meetings, and then we were refining the script. Luckily, motion graphic and animation parts, we can work at home, and then we can have a meeting with the Zoom. So this part was okay. But the problem was the photo shooting and film shooting. So our original plan was my collaborator is gonna go to London and then Germany, and go to California doing some interview, but it didn't happen. So our way of adaptation right now is like, I'm working on animation based on the photos. So I had to take the picture of this little loom, but the problem was that my collaborator, this is my property of my collaborator, and then she was extra be careful with COVID because her husband had a pneumonia before. So we actually met her in the sunroom, and then with the mask and then glove on, and then we took photograph. We take that photograph like very carefully. And then I actually need a lot of photo from her photos. So, but we were kind of uncomfortable like meeting physically. So I asked her to like give her a lot of direction that like, I need this angle and this kind of color, this kind of face expression and this kind of like cloth color. So she ended up take her picture by herself. So that we had a lot of like back and forth communication via email and phone call. Fortunately, we had a lot of archived photos because this is her family story. So she actually collected a lot of archive photos, and she has some kind of like a letter from the main character. So this is the letters she collected from her mother. So we have like many archive photos and the letter scanned, and then we have a huge space in the Google Drive, and we save there and we share the resources right now. And this is one of the archive photo from the main character. And I'm working on the animation with the photos. So I'm taking a lot of old objects. It's related to the story. So that's what I'm taking. And so we are working on it. Everything was paused, and then, but we're slowly working on it. So we do a lot of communication with via Zoom, and then with the students, we working on the Zoom, and then we have a meeting, and then some students, couple students working on the small animation based on the photos and pictures. And then I'm living in the Zoom class right now. So this is one of my classes. And then we have like a critics and communication via Zoom. So we don't have any like physical meetings, but I think my class was like going pretty well so far. So hopefully we can end up a good project at the end of the semester. But my own project wise, this is like kind of really delayed right now because the film interview and the voiceover and the recording and stuff like that. But my two other directors actually went to California during the summer, and then have some like a partial interview. But I think that everything's actually delayed at least 1 year. And then a lot of my conference and festival is delayed or canceled. So the good thing about the COVID is like we have more time to stay at home and focus on working. And then I'm trying to get outside every day and for walking at least an hour. That's my focus right now. So most of the times at home working and the class with the Zoom, and then like at least 1 hour for outside. That's my life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heejoo. So our next speaker is Alison Paul.
All right. I will share my screen. Make sure I'm on the right slide first. There we go. So I entitled this A Film Buff in Quarantine because I, more similarly to John, just really enjoyed having this time in my studio. Usually illustrators, it's best when you are kind of chained to your desk in your studio space with no distractions, no people trying to get you to go to the beach or some such thing. But my journey to make the pieces that are in the Benton right now, this one's titled Colin Farrell, Yorgos Lanthimos, Uma Thurman, Quentin Tarantino, and Jimmy Stewart, Alfred Hitchcock. These are large cut paper collages. This journey started before the pandemic in the spring. This photo is not from the spring of 2020. I don't have any other photos of me teaching. But when I was in the classroom, I was doing independent study with 2 students, and we were working on visual narratives. And around March 12th, right before spring break, as most people know, we were told spring break and then 2 weeks away from campus. And so the three of us quickly decided that we would study visual narratives as a way of continuing our work together, because they were making stop motion animations in labs with equipment that could not be replicated at home. And a lot of the class was already about writing scripts and making storyboards. And so we decided to kind of switch that over to film. I think all three of us are film buffs, so that helped. So this is not by me, this is by Christoph Niemann, but as we all know, those 3 weeks did not stay 3 weeks. It extended, so we turned it into more of a formalized class. We took on this textbook by Shea Serrano with illustrations by Arturo Torres. We used that as a loose guide, and we watched lots of movies and wrote about them and created work about them and met about them. And I think for all three of us, especially at a time like that was so uncertain, it was great to have something that so many people were doing anyways, like watching movies, running out of things to watch, quite frankly, and being able to kind of focus that energy to something more productive and then be able to socialize. That was when people were just kind of getting the hang of Zoom. I think actually our first meetings were in Skype, and being able to kind of have a social aspect of discussing them. It was a class setting, but it was a good outlet for all three of us in the early stages, especially. So one of the first films we watched, or actually the first group of films, because we were always watching at least 2 films and in some cases 3 films, like in this case, Pulp Fiction and Kill Bill, Volume 1 and 2. Excuse me. After that, at this point, we were a little bit further into the pandemic and people were really embracing this kind of being quarantined for so long. So Rear Window especially was getting a lot of publicity, a lot of recommendations for watching from various sources. This is the MoMA's Instagram. This is our own Sharon Butler's 2 Coats of Paint. I think because obviously being stuck inside, not being able to leave, and possibly being more interested in your neighbors who are also home more than normal. And I paired that with Rope, because that was a real quintessential film for Hitchcock and how his films would go after that. But in terms of this body of work, it actually wasn't until the end of the semester when I gave the students a chance to pick the films we watched. And then I created a response piece because they were the ones leading the class. One of my students picked The Lobster and The Killing of the Sacred Deer. They're both by Lanthimos. And I didn't realize at the time how influenced I was by the illustrations that Arturo Torres was doing, where he was having characters interact. This is from a chapter on which movie villain would be the most fun to hang out with. So I really thought about Yorgos Lanthimos, Greek director, working with Colin Farrell in both films, and how different Colin Farrell was in both films, and kind of because the other important thing to note is that Lanthimos wrote both films. How was he thinking about this actor being able to play such very different characters? In The Lobster, he's very insecure, timid, awkward. In The Killing of a Sacred Deer, his character is charming, bossy. He's a surgeon. He's very confident. And so to be able to get an actor to play those 2 very different roles, I think that was the thing that kind of inspired me. And then I thought, well, what if we put them in a situation, and both films have a scene in a diner. And I thought, well, what if these 2 were in a diner together? What would that look like? And so this was the inspiration for this. And then once the semester ended, and I had the summer, and it was pretty clear we were going to be quarantined through the summer, I began to work on pieces for the other films. So similarly, in this piece, I was picturing what, and there's Quentin Tarantino working with Uma Thurman in all the films. I was picturing what these two women might do together. And there's two pretty famous scenes in both films where they're driving away. One's kind of sticking with a life of crime and one's moving away from a life of crime. And you put two women with complicated backgrounds together in a car like that, and you set it in a film situation, you can't help but think of Thelma and Louise. So that definitely wove its way in there a little bit. I wanted to really play with perspective here, so you weren't quite sure if they were going off the rails or not. And then of course, I really got interested in Alfred Hitchcock working with Jimmy Stewart on not just 2, but 4 films. So The Man Who Knew Too Much and Vertigo, which are 2 of my favorite films. They probably are my favorite Hitchcock films. So in this one, it was a much bigger piece. It's almost twice as big as the others in the show, because there's 4 Jimmy Stewarts. So the trick here was to really try to focus in on kind of the most recognizable character, being Rear Window's Jimmy Stewart, and Vertigo. I believe that Jimmy Stewart and Rear Window would just watch Vertigo's Jimmy Stewart hanging off the rail, and when he's in The Man Who Knew Too Much, he kind of witnesses but wishes he hadn't witnessed. And Rope, he is much more passive, and he kind of helplessly watches these nefarious activities. So for me, because the films were made so close together and he looks so distinctive with his fedora and his suit, I had to really work to make sure the reactions to the scenes were happening properly. And of course, focusing on palette and making sure it felt like a Hitchcock film. But let's see here. I think my time is up. Yeah, great. That was the end. Love it.
Well, thanks so much. So our next speaker is Samantha Olschan.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen here. And let's see. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my approach to creativity during quarantine. I got hit pretty hard with feeling stuck at the beginning of quarantine. And I went through the 6 stages of quarantine that I think many of us may have gone through. I remember a week in early March and coming home and being like, I just need 2 weeks of uninterrupted time with no distractions to get all this work done. And I was working on an animation at the time, kind of experimental narrative piece, and I just couldn't do it anymore. I had to stop. And I started to go through these 6 phases of distraction being one, this idea of linking into Netflix. There's so much content online that seems unimportant, but it filled so much of our early days of quarantine. And how did that affect us? Panic during quarantine in my life. I wasn't a hoarder who overprepared. So panic actually allowed me to go into my community and support my local businesses and get to know people who I don't think I otherwise would have, even with our masks on. And that's something that I think will come up later in my work. The bread stage, which I think we've all gone through, not banana bread and not sourdough. I kind of deviated, but this was probably the first stage of creation that I was doing during quarantine. And I was doing it to feed and sustain other people, which was followed up by avoidance, right? Anyone have Zoom fatigue? I think by month 4, I just couldn't look at the screen anymore. And that led me to growth. I planted a pretty epic garden, a 3-season garden, and I've never done that before. This idea of planting seeds, also at the same time that the Black Lives Matter movement was picking up, protests were going on, and this idea of both growth and development, not just in my garden, but in larger communities, was something important to me in my process. And 6, which was finding joy. I found the quarantine very difficult, and finding joy in small things that I otherwise would have ignored became very important to me for both survival, for connection, and in my work. So really what it was all about was creative problem solving. I started to redefine and reframe how I was practicing in the stories that I was telling, and also just my processes. Just the simple first month of going, how are we going to eat? And where do I put my desk? My desk was a pile of books for the first 3 months. We were growing, vegetables from scraps. And art during quarantine, which was a hashtag started by the Getty Museum, the Getty Challenge, which I think the Benton you guys participated in, ended up becoming a very inspirational and important part of getting me out of those 6 stages of, well, I would say 4 stages of quarantine before growth. And I did a lot of art in quarantine, educational, what I'm going to call play, with my nieces. And we just had a blast doing it. And I realized what an important role art played in storytelling and survival of communities, not just through a reflected image, but through an actual live practice. And, also it gave me a reason not to fold my laundry, right? Turning it into the great wave here. This led to something called lateral thinking exercises that I started to do both in my classes and with my friends and my community. And I think similar to John, I was very inspired by surrealist parlor games and updating them into the digital. We did a series of updated Getty challenges with pop culture. So this is almost Alison, with movies, where we're seeing some connections here, where this is one where we had 5 minutes to recreate this scene from Commando, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. We also fought for an imaginary Corona Cup and tallied points based on who created the best image. From here, we went on to do live Photoshop mixes. We call it Photoshop Hero. This is something I do with my design lab classes, where we have timed live edited Photoshop moments. And I think they afforded us really interesting, odd cultural artifacts, kind of a mimetic expression we wouldn't have otherwise gotten. 1-minute art challenges. I feel like this hand sanitizer on the podium just says it all. Make an object, find an object in your house that looks like someone on the call in less than 3 minutes. Spell something without a writing utensil. So these are simple exercises we would absolutely play, as young designers or young artists, but it was really freeing for my community to open up and start to play again during quarantine and give ourselves permission to make in a fun way. Also, extremely tiny desk concerts actually became a reality. So this kind of siphoned its way into my teaching. And I was finding that my students weren't connecting on Husky CT or online as much. So I started to use Instagram with the account @motion_2, TOO, to basically blast out some learning. And this is my studio that eventually got set up after 3 months. And we would have guest lecturers from the history of animation and motion graphics come in. And this allowed me a range of kind of diverse narratives of makers, beyond Walt Disney, beyond Kid MoGraph, people they may not have seen. And I found they did connect with these types of posts online, and the learning was there, just in a different format. So around May, when that wrapped up, I had been collaborating and talking with some friends of mine, 2 Black actors, Sterling and Yasmin Suleiman. And Sterling wrote a really beautiful poem in response to the Ahmaud Arbery death and the larger Black Lives Matter movement. And we decided to turn this into an animation. And that's what I'm currently working on. And it's a really beautiful, stirring poem. And I'm really excited to bring this to life. And I'm giving myself the freedom to both play and explore based on the earlier, earlier kind of surrealist experiences and opportunities to play that I was doing in early quarantine. I'm also working now on a series of workshops with an elementary school. They're self-portrait workshops teaching students to embrace beauty and their differences through learning how to mix skin tones with paint, acrylic paint. And this has been very fun, both as an art process, as a play process, as a story of people process, and a design process, how we teach young learners, people who may be remote or in class. We don't know who we're designing the lesson for yet. And we're coming up with this sort of circle-based color code system so that maybe alternative learners, who are not able to read yet can also participate. So it's been a really rewarding and exciting workshop development. I've also served on a Connecticut Bar Association task force, and the CBA is producing a documentary called The Law Unmasked, which is capturing and cataloging video of lawyers and also individuals in Connecticut and sharing their experiences during COVID. So we've done the branding system, and the CBA really, they've been fantastic. They're collaborating with digital media and design, both Stanford and Storrs. And they also funded 2 of our students of color in a position to help build the logos over the summer. This is also leading into other collaborations with the CBA about policing, policing education. And this is something brand new that I'm working on. So through all of these experiences that I have kind of had during COVID, I've totally reframed my practice from narrative animation to what I'm going to call kind of animation with a message. So I'm very excited about that, and I can't wait to continue with the work. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. So our last speaker is Janet Pritchard. All right.
Okay. So I am going to read my presentation, otherwise I will be here for far too long. After committing to this panel, my first thoughts were about all the things I've canceled or cannot do because of COVID. Then I scolded myself for such petty thoughts, said suck it up, and punted with what I always do. I make photographs. In this presentation, I've tried to put the emphasis on what has happened with only a little bit of what hasn't, and how I use photography to keep my balance. I'll begin with a few notes about where my work was before, and I'm going to show a lot of slides with multiple photographs. It's a lot, I know, and although I believe each photograph is complete on its own, the collection is the focus tonight. The start of 2020 saw me working on my Guggenheim project on the Connecticut River. I visited the Metropolitan Museum of Art to photograph Cole's famous painting of the Oxbow shortly before things shut down. I was relieved to get there because it took a lot of time to set up and relied heavily on the kindness of many, including the director of the event, Nancy Stula, and Ann DeLeva. My plans were for the winter to go up north and make trips of views, and then to spend the spring in research archives. These are some of the photographs from those winter trips before things shut down. While working, I always document the process, location, data, and so on. My wife often accompanies me on these trips for this project, and we frequently photograph one another. So here we are at the Metropolitan, in a hotel for the night up north, going skating, photographing a bridge, and so on. Although I had some course released for my fellowship, I taught a graduate seminar and served on the faculty search committee for a new photographer last year. We began the process meeting face-to-face in fall and concluded with candidates making virtual visits to campus in spring. So it was face-to-face, Skype, and then Zoomland. Teaching began face-to-face and moved to Zoom. What you see here is the last photo I took in the art building before sheltering, a graduate seminar on Zoom, me in my robes getting ready to watch the 2020 graduation on YouTube, and a visiting artist with a class this fall. I flew to Houston on March 4th for the annual conference of the Society for Photographic Education. SPE has been a presence in my life since 1979. It's a place to learn about new work, share prints, network, and build community. It's not that I'm growing my hair out, although it's the longest it's been since 1978. It's just that I haven't had a haircut since February 28th. Well, that slide decided to take itself off the screen very quickly, so we'll just skip it. This is one of the greatest personal joys of my professional life has been working with my colleagues, Deborah Dancy, Ray DeCapua, and Judith Thorpe as the Hadrian's Wall Working Group. Our time together is precious, and we were saddened to cancel our 2020 field trip. I began sheltering time with photographs of family, an important part of my life. I used to make snapshots with a digital point and shoot, and now I use an iPhone with the Hipstamatic app. I like the way the filters patina an image, reminding me a photograph is separate from the thing being photographed. I post a lot of photographs on social media. It's become a way for me to collect my snapshots. In March, while still eating clementines, I began making patterns to photograph as a way to mark the passage of time. One clementine, one photograph, one day. Early after shutdown, we moved our COVID walks to campus because the Mansfield Hollow State Park was too crowded. It's just the three of us stretching our legs, enjoying the air, and seeing what's changed. Although we often enjoy wine in the evenings, it didn't take long before we decided cocktails on the weekend could provide another way to mark time, the passage of each week. I have photographed our backyard for almost 20 years now, frequently through the second-story windows. I love the way the record marks another passage of time, changes of season, light, weather, and changes in our family life. On April 15th, photographer John Fall died from COVID-19. I had the opportunity to get to know John a little when younger and admire his work. On April 16th, I posted 2 photographs in memoriam to be viewed sequentially and wrote, John Fall understood the fundamental nature of vantage point in photography as no one else. Hashtag RIP John Fall. Sometimes my snapshots are in color and look like I made them with my, quote, real camera. I'm a bit of a sucker for mixed light, as you can see here. My field work has not come to a complete halt, although I haven't ventured out far or often. These photographs were made as part of my Connecticut River project over spring and summer. Home has been a focus. The way our summer sheets rumple often reminds me of Imogen Cunningham's 1957 photograph Unmade Bed, and I reach for my camera phone. Isaiah struck a blow, and then there was a power outage, and life goes on day by day. I spent most of June fine-tuning my upcoming book, More Than Scenery, Yellowstone, An American Love Story. It's a large book, and the details seem endless, but I'm excited to see it come together. This example is from the section titled Collecting Yellowstone, which contains a few grids such as this. I spent much of July and August... I spent much of July and August digging myself... It won't stay there, will it? It doesn't want to stay there. Okay, we'll skip it. Digging myself out from 20 years' worth of work in my study and my library. Most photographers photograph their dogs, and I photograph sky. A notable example is Robert Adams' book titled I Hear the Leaves and Love the Light, a collection of photographs of Sally, a West Highland White Terrier, in her backyard. An abiding passion of mine is to photograph trees. I notice them everywhere and honor my attention with my camera. The Connecticut River has been a presence in my mind since moving to Connecticut in August 2001. At first I noticed it as a socioeconomic dividing line. By now, its flow occupies my mind's eye. Although I was not able to work in my studio to prepare larger work for the faculty show, I made do with small prints I could fashion at home. Here you see two of my sons, Sean and Billy, enjoying a cold brew at the headwaters of the Connecticut River. If you haven't been able to get to the Benton to see the show, these are the 4 images of mine that are hanging there now. I close with an image of my wife made last week. When I posted it on Instagram, Deborah Dancy commented, Vermeer, being compared to one who revered the power of light and human vision is high praise for a photographer who views her snapshots as small moments of grace. However, just before this presentation started, after spinning this afternoon, before coming up to get ready, I took a picture of my crazy hair as it continues to evolve, and I thought I'd add that in just because I think it's kind of fun. So, that's it.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. It's great, like, hearing these stories and, you know, seeing all of these different different relationships that, you know, you can kind of see, like Samantha was talking about, just across, you know, some of the things that that we've been dealing with. So we have loads of time for questions since everyone was really awesome and you know, kind of stuck to time, which I very much appreciate. I mean, I'll start with questions. I mean, one question I had, and you all might have questions for each other too, was something that I ask myself all the time, you know, trying to imagine where this is going to take me. You know, if there's anything that I'm doing that I can see, you know, myself kind of continuing in the future. I mean, that's sort of, you know, my question, looking ahead to, I don't know, in a year or whenever, you know, we can kind of imagine things maybe getting back to where they were before, you know, like what you think you'll be taking with you moving forward, if anything.
I think that I think there's going to be a number of things that are different, probably not as many as there should be in terms of social issues. I think some of those things are pretty intractable at this point. But, you know, there's a lot of little things that are being done differently on all levels of our lives, and some of those things I think are going to stick because they just seem to make sense. There's ways I'm being able to teach in Zoom that are convenient, that I'd like to find ways to keep. Just as simple as uploading things through the chat to my students live, you know, in real time as we're talking, as a way of sharing data and documents. That's turned out to be pretty convenient and pretty compelling. But I certainly don't want to continue teaching in Zoomland for the rest of my life just to be able to take advantage of the chat. So how will that morph, you know? That's just a small example, but I think there's a lot of things that we're going to reconsider how we do them. And it's going to be an interesting process. But everybody's trying to predict, and I don't think we know. I think we just have to live through it.
Yeah, I would agree with that too. And I think there's certainly things that I've put into practice that I will keep. And I think one of those is finding balance between the digital and the tangible. You know, without being able to go outside and without being able to garden, how is that? I wouldn't have been able to be online all that time. So finding balance in life is very important for both your physical health, your mental health, and I think as an educator and an artist. That's something I'll certainly keep. I also think thinking about my practice as a necessity or something necessary, right? Art is necessary to our healing right now, socially, physically. Not that I didn't think that before, but I think that now more than ever through things like the Getty Challenge or being able to make, an animation in support of Black Lives Matter, or doing any of the work I'm doing, I think is very important now. A couple years, not a couple years, but I had a professor once who had told me, your talent is not a gift, it's an obligation. And I think I kind of went, oh yeah, whatever. And now in quarantine, now more than ever, I understand that statement because I have the skills, I have the time, and now what am I going to do with it? So I hope that's something that I can help buoy my students with as well. And, without pressure, also taking the pressure off and incorporating play.
Yeah, and kind of what I liked about Sam's talk was like these ideas of what do you prioritize and how do you recognize what it is you're going through. And so I think that the way that I'll carry those types of ideas in my research is through compartmentalizing things more rather than thinking I can do 8 things all at once, realizing that if I'm not able to be in the print shop for 7 months, what does that look like? And I never really had an excuse to visualize that before. And now even when we're back to school, I can't get in the print shop on the weekend, which was kind of something that I did frequently. So from a research perspective, when everything that you're kind of familiar with at maintaining an order in your calendar, that's like a big shift. And so it just helped me compartmentalize. And I hope that I am able to maintain that once there are more kind of freedoms or access. I think the big thing that will be challenging is just not being able to travel for different exhibitions or performance or research. And that's kind of one of those whiny privilege things, but it's a real struggle if your work takes place outside of the state of Connecticut, and if it's outside of the country. So that's kind of just my reflections on what's possible, what made me realize my limitations through this whole process.
And I think it's important for us as educators to model for our students and to do what we tell them to do. And one of the things I'm constantly telling my students to do is not to whine about I don't have the perfect piece of equipment that I need that's super expensive, or I can't get this or that or be there. And I'm like, you just need to make work. You just need to keep making work, no matter where, under any conditions. And although I don't show the work that I showed tonight very often, except outside a small group of friends on social media with my private accounts, a number of those people are alums, and I hope that it's an interesting experience for them to see that side of what I do, because I make photographs. I make over 1,000 photographs on my iPhone every month, and I have for 20 years. Worked digitally that way, and it's just a way of being in the world for me. And I think that's important for people to realize. It's a different way of being in the world. So there's social functions, but there's also personal functions, and they all get wrapped up with one another.
Yeah, I think my changes are mainly in the classroom, except for that maybe this showed me that I should just not leave my studio all summer and make food and watch movies. But I think in terms of teaching and trying to be a lemonade maker, the students, especially that first semester, when they went home, their work plummeted, which kind of made zero sense because illustrators work at home. And they didn't particularly, the illustration students especially, didn't particularly need anything that was on campus. And so it was actually like a wake-up call for me as a professor to say, okay, maybe I should incorporate some part of this post-pandemic where they're really looking at the spaces that they're in and realizing that they're not going to graduate and then like take a little briefcase and like go to like the illustration job, and there's going to be like all these materials and stuff that they're going to be making, especially their work when they first graduate, probably like I did in a corner of a bedroom, you know. And how do you make sure you have some of the tools you need, and to start purchasing them now while you've got some loan money and some parental help, et cetera, et cetera. So I think maybe some of my students are watching this and they're horrified, but it's probably going to be incorporated more into the classroom in the future.
Yeah, I have a similar situation because my students don't need classroom, honestly, because we working on like soft Adobe and then laptop. So we don't have any like huge differences except like physical face-to-face meeting. But I think that the most challenging in this period of time is that like we have more time, but how we manage our time is very crucial. So for me, it's like if I need to work, like I can be in front of a computer like all day long. So the most important thing, the first priority thing right now is like I'm trying to get out like in the morning first. So that I could get some like more motivation, because some students like actually talking about like their motivation is getting lower than before because we're not physically meeting each other. So I think that like that's the most challenging parts, that how we manage our life because we have more time all of a sudden. So I think that that's kind of interesting, and that's something that we need to just like go through kind of thing.
My students do need resources on campus in a big, big way. So in the photo program, we've had to cancel some classes. We're not willing to be in the darkroom right now. It's not possible with physical distancing. But also, they don't have regular access to the printers and other pieces of equipment in Dazzle. So we've had to really radically, in some ways, rethink just what it is that we're teaching them. And it's been a really interesting and thought-provoking process. And some of those ideas will probably stick with us too. So, you know, it's not something I don't think any of us would have chosen. But I think all of us are pretty fortunate and for the most part able to find it more interesting than terrifying, unlike many other people, because we are privileged.
I agree a little. Sorry, I'm just going to add one more thing. I agree with Janet that one of the biggest challenges I think that our classes face, and we might even, you know, be digital Heejoo, but there's such an important sense of community when students are working together in a classroom, or even if they're not working, if they're playing, right? If they're making a meme, you know, or talking about a meme. And that lack of space is changing the way they're forming communities. And some of the research that I'm doing through my work right now is about how we form those communities online and how we can apply it to this type of teaching in quarantine. And I hope it's over soon, but it's interesting to see how we can develop ways of doing that.
Yeah, that's an important point, because one of the things that I found as the field of photography transitioned, which really started for me, I started teaching digital in photography long before many people. I think I taught my first class in 91 or 92. And by 10 years ago, the transition from traditional wet processes to digital in terms of sort of dominating the field was pretty much complete. But the darkroom was always the hub of community, and it was where those peer-to-peer interactions happened. And that's a hugely important part of the learning process at any level, for students and for us with our peers as well, which is one of the things I love so much about working with Deborah and Ray and Judy with the Hadrian's Wall group. The way we bounce off of each other with all of our, you know, many, many combined years of experience is completely different than we can bounce off of anybody else in the type of work that we do. So trying to find that for the photo students was one of the things that really led me to push and develop the dazzle, because now a lot of that kind of stuff that used to happen in the dark room, where the students gather and they spend time together and supporting each other and pushing each other, and all those funny things that we think of as play but really are just another more free-form form of learning, take place there. And yeah, how do we make that happen online is a really interesting and difficult question. And if you figure it out, Samantha, let me know.
Yeah, I mean, I think especially when we're, thinking of, so teaching art and making art, but also, just looking at art and consuming art. I mean, visitation in any museum that's open right now is down like 80%. So you're really reaching people online, and I mean, we can't have a program like this in person in the galleries, so here we are on Zoom. I mean, it's been, even though as an art historian, you're kind of used to sort of looking at digital images of things that are really not meant to be consumed that way, maybe, I mean, all thinking of all the things you lose, like scale and everything else. It's also been just something to I don't know, just kind of get over, and then figure out, like, well, what can you do with it that you couldn't do otherwise. I mean, I have a whole program, where we just look at like one work of art for about half an hour, and just even thinking about what to include. I haven't done a sculpture yet, and I don't know if I will, because I just don't think it's possible, but there is something to be said for the really nice image of some of these artworks too. Yeah. So we haven't really had questions so far from the attendees, so I'm hoping that we might hear from some people through the Q&A.
So we should browbeat them now, right? That's what we're reached that part of the evening.
All right, so we do have one from Jennifer Davies or Davis, and I mean, we can all read it, but it says, it was great to see the ways all of your work has been affected and shaped by COVID, but hasn't necessarily been directly about COVID. I felt a sort of self-induced pressure to make art about the experience of living through the time of COVID, but have been much more drawn to make work that has nothing to do with COVID, perhaps as a way to escape from it. So does anyone sort of relate to that feeling?
I think for quite a number of people, there's been a fair bit of anxiety about all the uncertainties. What's going on in national politics isn't helping many of us, and the list goes on and on. So, yeah, I mean, art making as a form of escape or as a form of therapy or as a form of self-involved survival is certainly something that I question myself about, because, the pictures I showed tonight, it's all about my little world. It's not going to change the world. And should I feel guilty about that, or irresponsible, or, the list goes on. I don't think I can avoid those questions. I don't know. I can't speak for anybody else in the group, but yes, those questions do come up. I don't have any answers. I just ask questions.
For me, because personally, I didn't experience that, but a lot of my Asian friend who lives in United States in different state experience on the store, like get yelled or like verbally attacked by other people because we look we look Asian, we are Asian. So that makes me think about a lot of different things about related to Black Lives Matters. But like how, because we're, you know, like they mostly attacked Chinese, but a lot of Asian got attacked in New York City and Chicago and like California. So that makes me think about like how we like face this another form of the racism based on this coronavirus pandemic. So that makes me think about some other concept of my work. So I've been working with racism and sexism and stuff like that, but this is like a little bit different way of approach this matters. So, yeah.
Jennifer, I totally feel that feeling. I think that at the start of quarantine, I did feel the pressure. Having been a former news broadcast designer, I was like, I got to see what colors everyone's using and then figure out what colors we're using. And part of the documentary I'm helping to produce is did some research into how people were visualizing COVID and the stories of COVID. And what I found, I think, through my experience of wanting to make work about COVID is that there's many diseases, right? Heejoo, you're outlining one right now, you know, racism, sexism, right? It's so much more than just one virus. That is like one small part of that. And there's so many stories to tell. And the virus is kind of the gate that opened those stories, right? So I think that, you know, for me, I think it's too soon to make something specifically about COVID, but I think all of the things that I've been making and have planned to make are a direct reaction to COVID or the other diseases or infections or, you know, ill will that COVID has highlighted in my country and in my life.
So we have another question from Ryan quickly for Alison, asking about your process. So how you make your work.
If you can go to another question, I can pull together like 4 images that will help. Otherwise, it's a lot of hands and it's like weird.
Okay.
So
sure. Another one of the great sort of weird advantages. I mean, I've definitely experienced this in meetings and other places where you can just pull. It's like, oh, I'll just share my screen and we'll look at this thing together. So another question from Caitlin Santoro, any advice on how to get through the mid-semester burnout? It seems so much worse in the pandemic and with the upcoming election.
I have one piece of advice is that I was talking to a student about this the other day, and this concept kind of like became articulated in a way that it hadn't before. Like I explained to them that depending on what type of art you're making, like when I make watercolors, it's very much this repetitive meditative process. And I said that it's a lot like like when you meditate, it's for that experience in that space and you might feel relaxed later. But if you're working on meditative art, you get something for your effort after. It's like getting a prize after meditation or getting some type of like physical relic. So realizing that mid-semester burnout is the result of having a lot of projects. And I feel like a lot of people are afraid to take too much time for self-care because they don't want to miss out on the obligations. But if you can find a way to not even like reprogram, but just slightly reconsider the small steps that you're taking with your projects and think about how they might be able to be slowed down and turned into a more contemplative or meditative process, which easier said than done, but it's a lot easier if you enter that space with that type of framework in mind. So that's just some like ideas about how you can kind of address burnout through a productive way and kind of entering it as this mindful process. Not that you're not doing that anyway, but being more conscious of that response.
So I have a slightly different take on that. I think of the arc of the semester as being like days of the week, and when you get to the middle of the semester and you're in the Wednesday, everybody's energy is pretty low and things seem sort of despondent. And with the election going on right now and COVID, I think, it's all just magnified and maybe even worse than ever. And sometimes I think you just need to say a word I probably shouldn't say in public here, and throw up your hands and do something that's fun. But I mean creative fun. So, I had a big Wednesday when I was in graduate school, and it went on for about almost a whole semester, actually. But I took my camera that I was working with. I was making all this very serious work with my 4x5, and I decided to spend, actually, I probably spent about 3 or 4 weeks doing this, but I just used it in a totally different way. And I used it to make snapshots and very casual photographs that had nothing to do with my bigger projects, just to refresh myself, because sometimes you just have to fall back in love with what you do, instead of putting all this pressure on yourself constantly. And so, I think maybe as teachers, we need to help the students fall back in love with what they do. And sometimes that means taking the pressure off. So, I've been very reluctant to totally map out my classes this semester in the way I normally would, because I've been wanting to watch how things were progressing and trying to leave myself more room to be responsive, so that if we have a need to step back and just all have fun again and fall back in love with what we do, we can. And I'm thinking it's about time for that right now. Judging by Alison's head movements, I'm thinking she's not quite there yet.
Okay, I'm ready. So, actually, man, this is exactly what my students have to see all the time, is me moving things around. So I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to go over to preview, because it's a difficult process to describe, especially for this series. I wanted to work with illustrations that most the part of it was kind of already done. So I worked with these heads that someone else had illustrated but were in public domain, and then I modified them. I know I modified them a lot, but it was fun to have a jumping off point there. And obviously looking at reference while doing so. That's a shout out to my students. And then I just slowly but surely, it's a long process, but it's a process that I find very meditative. I certainly use art as an escape, and I often tell my students they can use it as expression or escape, because I definitely use it as escape. I rarely talk about things that are upsetting me. I just want to get in that car with them and possibly drive off the cliff, I'm not sure. So drawing on tracing paper with pencil, and then figuring out the parts that I want to cut out, and using an X-Acto knife and going through the tracing paper, and just compiling. Sometimes I draw back into things. Those headlights are all drawn onto the same paper that the grill is made from. And then yeah, just keep working that way. I think I had one more image, but that's fine. Hope that explains a little bit.
So
are we frozen?
no.
Nope.
That,
Everyone else looks frozen to me, but that's all right.
You're frozen a little bit. I'll move on to another question. Alison, it looks like you came back. From Michael Orwitz, who's talking about references to past art and artists. So from John, Surrealism, Alison, Hitchcock, and Janet, History of Photography. So in what ways do these traditions inform your practice as artists, and how do you keep them at bay?
I find that these types of concepts enter my experience as an artist, not through art history often, but through popular culture that's been influenced by art history. I feel like clickbait is something that can only emerge in a culture that's already so saturated with irony that may be the result of like post-Dada entering different like concepts of film or advertisement. And then once I realize that it's happening, I have a context for directing that process, either to the overt kind of parlor games or collage games or drawing games, or even just the whole burdensome institution of surrealism. So I feel like as soon as it gets too close, then I know I've gone too far. So it's kind of this back and forth. And sometimes I don't know if it's really a direct interaction with art history, or if it's just society kind of channeling those art history concepts to me. So that's kind of how I think about it as it results to, or as it connects to surrealism and even the historical printmaking that I'm interested in.
This is a topic I could talk about for a long time, so I'll try to make it short because it fascinates me a great deal. I think my relationship to reference and influence is been going on for many, many years. It's evolved and it's taken different forms. And I do at times have felt myself sort of in a Bloomian state of the anxiety of influence, for sure. In particular, early on in my Yellowstone project, I had a pretty big period of self-doubt when I was starting that, because of the depth of the history of the landscape and its representation in visual art, and the significance of all that, and wondering who the heck I was to try and insert myself in that history. But also the other thing that I think is really important for me, and one of the reasons I really do strongly encourage our students to try and lap up everything they can get in their art history courses, and promoting the significance of those courses for them as working artists so they don't have to reinvent the wheel, is the fact that photographs in my mind become vocabulary. It's like having words for someone who writes. And I remember an experience about 20 years ago. So I was in my early 40s, and I was walking through, I was in New York, and I was walking through the southern part of Central Park, and on the streets on the east side. And everywhere I stepped, I saw another photograph. And it was just a day that was littered with photographs through the city for me, and it was sort of a remarkable experience. And it's hard for me to look at a lot of things without seeing other photographs at this point in my life. I've seen so many, and I care about them a great deal, and I think that just enriches my work. There's times when I've directly copied people, and I'm good with that because I can never be them. So even though I think of myself as directly copying them, it's never quite the same. Appropriation aside, of course, which is another story, conceptually. But it enriches my work. It enriches the viewer's experience of my work, I hope. And I like to think that my work functions on multiple levels so that others who view it and have a knowledge of the richness of the history of art and photography also will see some of those influences and recognize that I am in conversation with those people. It's not just me out there making that work. It's me as part of a much larger community. Some of those people are still alive and some of them are not, but we're still... I'm having a conversation with them. It just may be a little one-sided.
So we have time for additional questions. If any of the attendees want to put anything in the Q&A box, or if any of the panelists have any questions or comments, things that you want to add to the discussion.
I did just realize that Michael was also asking about Hitchcock and myself. I think, I'll try to keep it brief. I think what's interesting as an illustrator is you often have a jumping off point, especially for a body of work like the one I just made, where you're directly referencing something. So it becomes part of the challenge, which I enjoy. How can my voice shine through, even though I'm using characters and settings and even palettes of other people? And I hope my humor comes in. I, kind of exaggerated the proportions in the bodies and the perspectives. It's like multiple perspectives kind of crashing in on each other, and they're kind of in me imagining these characters in a scene together, all these kind of parts of my voice, but wanting to make sure that people who are looking at them aren't missing the reference that I'm trying to make. So I find that challenge exciting, and is probably why I'm an illustrator.
For us. So thanks so much, everyone. I wish we could go out to dinner right now and celebrate our achievements on our panel, but some other time. So hope to see you again soon at the museum.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.